In August 1914, the world held its collective breath as the long-anticipated war to end all wars finally broke out. New Zealand was drawn into the conflict as an integral part of the British Empire. But now, over 100 years later, it's time for us to follow in the footsteps of our own local units, the Otago Infantry Regiment and the Otago Mounted Rifles, made up primarily of men from south of the Waitaki River. My name is Sean Brosnan, and this is the Journey of the Otagos. When war was declared in early August 1914, the response from Otago and Southland was immediate and enthusiastic. Men immediately began to arrive at recruiting offices and offer their services. There were two main units that they could serve in, the Otago Infantry Battalion and the Otago Mounted Rifles. Altogether 1,100 infantrymen were to be selected, 600 horsemen, and from all across the province they arrived here, coming by train from the south, from Central Otago, from North Otago, and concentrating here in Dunedin at Tahuna camp. These fields were covered with tents, and for 6 weeks those men learnt to become soldiers at a very basic level. They got their uniforms, they learnt drill, basic training, absolutely basic training. The horsemen over the hill at Ocean Beach, galloping up and down, learning how to coordinate their movements. And every weekend, and often at night, there would be crowds of spectators coming to see what was really the greatest show in town. Frequently they would parade for the public, and the people would be gathered here, filling up the grandstand over there. The mayor would come and give speeches, there would be choirs, and there was an air of excitement about it, which would be lost later in the war as the true cost of the battles began to bite. But at the beginning, it was all one great adventure, and for the Otagos, this is where the journey began.
There was great enthusiasm for the idea of enlisting and heading off overseas. And there'd been a lot of talk about taking the Kaiser on, fighting the Germans, sorting it out properly in France.
I think there was more excitement than apprehension at that point, because it was the great adventure, you know, that they were, Ormond Burton's phrase, that they were engaging in. And there was this sort of hazy feeling, as you put, sort of, all that boys' own stuff that was in their heads that was whizzing around, sort of a chance to prove themselves, chance to see the world and have a bit of adventure and hopefully come back really unscathed. So it was pretty positive, actually, feeling and full of hope, of a rather naive kind probably, but nevertheless it was essentially a positive feeling, I think.
Remember that mostly these guys were, late teens, early 20s. Their horizons were fairly limited by the fact that they lived in a couple of islands, in the South Pacific, miles away from anywhere. Limited too by the cost that to get them to Britain if they wanted to go to Britain, and they saw this probably as their only opportunity for a bit of free adventure, or adventure on on the government's bill, and so off they went.
Initially, I think, as everywhere else, there was probably an over-representation of labouring men who may have been out of work, but it was across the board amongst younger men. Obviously there was a reluctance on the part of business people, those running farms, those advancing in the professions. In each of those cases it was a bit more difficult, but nevertheless you had people from all walks of life, including from the university. Yeah.
Here comes an opportunity to enlist and head off overseas, and you're in your mid-20s, you're bomb-proof. Who in that age, in those times, would think they were heading off to die? They were heading off for a great adventure.
But there was a lot of societal pressure as well, and then there were those that genuinely believed they're doing their duty by the empire, and perhaps the better educated also thought about defending an open society.
And the idea of poor little Belgium and what had happened to the country of Belgium with the Germans heading down through there, trying to invade France. So there was an idea here that heading off overseas was a really positive thing for young New Zealand men to do. And they'd been instilled with this idea of sacrifice for the empire, probably for a decade beforehand. Epics of the Boer War, people had grown up on those stories. So that serving the empire, sacrificing yourself for the empire, getting herself a wonderful medal at the end of it. It was all the sort of thing that young men had been brought up on.
This initial enthusiasm was not only displayed by men. Southern women formed patriotic associations to provide for the departing soldiers.
Patriotic fundraising was all the rage. I mean, the women got in behind equipping the soldiers. It's amazing to think in 1914 they had to supply their own shirts, find their footwear, bring their saddlery with them. So the patriotic parcels the women put together were of immense value. They seriously did knit soldiers socks and jerseys and comforts. Then they raised money for the relief efforts as well. The Mayoress of Invercargill got in behind it and said, right, let's raise money for the war effort. Let's raise money for the refugees in Europe. Let's get in behind this thing. So they really helped promote it.
Well, the main way they contributed here, as everywhere else, was a bit frustrating, really. I mean, that involved an awful lot of knitting and sewing and production of things like socks and balaclavas, which weren't much appreciated at first in Gallipoli, but when it turned cold towards the end of that campaign, they were appreciated. Food parcels, fundraising, organising endless picnics and get-togethers to raise money for the boys. But it's not like the Second World War where women were so much more directly involved. Apart from the 300-odd nurses that went overseas, most New Zealand women just had to basically knit and organise and wait.
This was still part of what was then called the Early Settlers Museum, but it was a hall. It was a hall that was used during the weeks for dances and all sorts of gatherings. People could rent it out for whatever they wanted. Now, right from the beginning of the war, the Early Settlers Association decided to make its patriotic contribution by handing the hall over to the good ladies who were going to form a patriotic association for Dunedin, the Otago Women's Patriotic Association. And when war was declared, they immediately signed up for that activity of preparing shirts and balaclavas and comforters and all sorts of things that the soldiers were going to need as part of their basic kits. You might think shirts would be part of the army uniform, but apparently not. In August 1914, the very first target for these ladies was to make 1,500 shirts. Following the euphoria of enlistment, the men now undertook 6 weeks of intensive training around the Dunedin area before departing overseas. The soon-to-be soldiers now got their first taste of military life.
Well, the people who enlisted in 1914, the ones who were accepted, had all done some military service. That was the whole idea. From 1912, we'd had this territorial service with conscripted training in parts of Otago and Southland. So they'd got the basics of military drill. They knew how to fire a rifle, they knew how to march, they probably knew how to dig trenches and work together.
What I would say was that the New Zealanders generally were seen to have been trained better than any other forces called up at the spur of the moment.
Fresh-faced and newly equipped, the troops paraded frequently through Dunedin during August and September 1914. These parades were very well received by a highly patriotic Dunedin public. But then it was time for action. Orders to depart were finally received, and in the early morning of Tuesday the 22nd of September, the troops entrained at Tahuna Park for the docks at Port Chalmers. They left with no cheering or fanfare. The Otago's journey to war had finally begun.